Betty Lou Zakowski was a 5th grader attending the Valentine School in Chicopee, Massachusetts. She was 10 years old, 4 feet 7 inches tall, and weighed 75 pounds. By all accounts, Betty was not a shy or timid girl. Her best friend, Lisa, recalled her as adventurous and outgoing. She had dyed her hair blonde, wore jewelry and makeup, and even hung out with groups much older than her. She carried an air of confidence rarely seen in someone her age. Her parents, Stanley and Mildred, were raising their family in a close and friendly community, where kids frequently played on the streets into the night. This trusting atmosphere is precisely what made the events we're going to touch on so disorienting. At approximately 6 p.m. on the evening of Thursday, May 26, 1966, Betty received a phone call. She told her mother, Mildred, that the caller was one of her girlfriends and that she was going to head out. Investigators would later assess that this phone call was almost certainly not from who Betty claimed. DA Anthony Gallooni stated that after being called at home, Betty left and met up with the caller and eventually ended up in West Springfield after riding in a vehicle operated by someone she trusted. West Springfield is approximately 5 miles from the neighborhood where the Zakowski family lived. When Betty did not come home that evening, Stanley and Mildred decided to call the police. The police department responded by issuing an all-states alarm, a regional broadcast designed to alert surrounding agencies to the disappearance so that patrol officers across multiple jurisdictions could be on alert for the missing child. Despite this, no one came forward that evening with information about her whereabouts. Then, 4 days later, on May 30th, a major discovery was made. A group of young boys had gone fishing in the Westfield River in West Springfield, a stretch of river near the intersection of Westfield and Dewey Streets, adjacent to Robinson State Park. As the boys fished that morning, one of them discovered Betty's body just offshore in the water. She was beaten and covered in mud, lying partially submerged near the bank. The boys immediately reported what they had found, and emergency responders were dispatched to the scene. The official cause of death was determined to be a combination of 3 factors. This included multiple blunt force injuries to the head, a skull fracture, and terminal drowning. The mud coating her body indicates she had been in or near the river for a significant period, likely from the same night she initially disappeared on. Upon the discovery, law enforcement mobilized rapidly. Media reports from the time describe an intensive search of the shoreline near where the body was found, with investigators combing the banks for physical evidence. Divers were also deployed into the river itself to search for evidence that might have been thrown into the water or carried by the current from the scene of the attack. No meaningful evidence was found at the scene. Detectives simultaneously began an effort to reconstruct Betty's movements in the hours before her death, interviewing her family, friends, and classmates to build a picture of who she had been in contact with and who she might have been going to meet on the evening of May 26th. It was during these interviews that Betty's social patterns began to come into focus. Her habit of spending time with older boys, her secret meetings with the boy her friends knew only as Ralph, and her willingness to keep details from her parents. With this information, officials suspected that the caller was likely a teenage boy who picked up Betty and eventually stopped by the park. Whether the killing had occurred at that exact location or elsewhere could not be determined. Approximately 1 week after Betty's remains were discovered, investigators released a composite sketch of the suspect to the public. The sketch had been developed based on accounts provided by 2 witnesses. One of these witnesses was believed to be the last person to have seen Betty alive. The sketch was circulated widely in local newspapers and generated a large volume of tips from residents who thought they recognized the young man depicted. Despite the tips and the public attention, none of the leads pointed investigators to a specific actionable suspect. The composite was filed away with the rest of the case materials, and the investigation gradually lost momentum. Real quick, if you haven't done so already, go follow my Spotify linked in the description. I upload videos there early, sometimes up to a week before they pop up on YouTube. And now back to the video. However, this sketch would circle back decades later as the major turning point in the case. For nearly 3 decades, the murder remained dormant in the files. Meanwhile, the man responsible was living what appeared on the surface to be an ordinary life in the same area. Donald Raymond Mars had been a 17-year-old student at Chicopee Comprehensive High School in 1966, the same year Betty was killed. He was a member of the school's bowling and chess clubs and graduated in 1967. After high school, he briefly served in the Navy. He later married and had 3 children and was working at the R.E. Felon manufacturing plant in East Longmeadow in the early 1980s. His father, Roger, was a well-known figure locally as he owned Mars Heating and Service. Roger had served in Korea, and at least 2 of his 5 sons followed him into military service. The next documented moment that ties Donald to an act of violence is 1977, 11 years after Betty's killing. The circumstances are striking, and they raise questions that have never been fully answered. In 1977, Donald discovered the body of his friend Russell Schlatter in Schlatter's apartment on the west side of Springfield, Massachusetts. Schlatter, 39 years old, had been murdered. He was found nude with an electrical cord wrapped tightly around his neck and a necktie knotted around his body. The man responsible was Richard Ratcliffe, who went by the street name Cherokee. On the night of the murder, Schlatter and Ratcliffe had spent the evening drinking heavily together at a bar called The Arbor, a well-known gay establishment in downtown Springfield. On October 28, 1977, Ratcliffe pleaded guilty in court to second-degree murder in connection with Schlatter's death. Donald was a witness in this case, and he testified at trial, identifying Ratcliffe as the man who had been with Schlatter on the night of the killing. What makes Donald's involvement in this event notable is that he was present at the bar and seen hanging out with Schlatter and Ratcliffe on the night of the murder. Some implied that Donald was not just an acquaintance who simply stumbled across a murder scene the following day. His exact movements that night after leaving the bar are not clear in public records, and to be clear, Donald was never charged in any connection to this death, but nevertheless, it is a meaningful event when examining Donald's life as a whole and the company he kept around. It was 3 years after this incident that Donald married his previously mentioned wife and had his 3 kids. And for a time, it seemed that his life was peaceful. However, this changed around 1987. Donald experienced 1 or more serious mental health crises requiring hospitalization. According to officials, his ex-wife told investigators that he had suffered several nervous breakdowns during their marriage that required inpatient treatment. He told his wife that he needed to be honest with her. What followed was a confession that, had it been reported to law enforcement at the time, would have broken the case open 35 years earlier than it ultimately was. Donald admitted to his wife that he and an unnamed friend had killed Betty Lou Zukowski. He told her the child was killed with a rock and that Betty's body had been dumped at Robinson State Park in West Springfield. Donald's wife did not go to the police. Whatever her reasons, whether it was fear, shock, disbelief, or some combination of all of these, she kept this confession to herself and remained in the marriage. Then in 1994, Donald was charged with criminal offenses against a child in Massachusetts, crimes entirely separate from Betty's murder. Specific details on this crime are not highly detailed, but what is known is that Donald was ultimately convicted of 2 counts of assaults and 3 counts of indecent assault and battery on a minor. Critically, prior to his release, Donald was evaluated by state psychiatrists who determined that he met the criteria for being a serious threat if released into the public. He was then committed to the Massachusetts Treatment Center in Bridgewater, a medium security facility that specifically houses persons committed as dangerous, separate from the general prison population. In June 1997, Donald was released and placed on probation, which he violated shortly after. 2 warrants were issued and he was committed to MCI Cedar Junction, one of Massachusetts' maximum security prisons, for a sentence of 5 to 7 years. It was also in this same window that the West Springfield Police Department began receiving the first information potentially connecting Donald to Betty's murder from multiple different sources. Detectives from the West Springfield Police Department compiled a photo array that included images from the 1967 Chicopee High School yearbook. They presented the images to a witness, and of the 30, he identified 2 as reminding him of the person he had seen last with Betty. One of those photos was of Donald. This was not an ironclad identification. The witness said Donald only reminded him of the person, not that he was certain. Still, it was a meaningful piece of evidence that placed Donald in the scope of the law enforcement directly connected to Betty's case. Separately, investigators obtained a statement from Donald's own mother, Marilyn. She told investigators that Donald had admitted to her at some prior point that he had thrown a rock and killed a little girl. Combined with the yearbook photo identification, it was enough to push Donald to the center of the investigation. Despite the yearbook identification and the mother's account, no arrest was made in 1997. Investigators confirmed in 2022 that they conducted multiple interviews during this period, but the decision was made not to pursue charges. The likely explanation was that what they had was simply not enough for prosecutors to confidently take Donald to trial and win. Donald was not informed that he was a suspect, and the investigative thread was placed back into the files without producing an arrest. In 1999, Donald was arrested for violating his probation. This led to a new sentence of up to 7 years, which he served at MCI Cedar Junction, one of Massachusetts' maximum security prisons. His personal life had collapsed entirely by this point. His son was struck and killed by a car in the year 2000 at age 14. Donald was also estranged from his family to such a degree that his name was reportedly not included in a 2010 newspaper notice his parents submitted announcing the renewal of their wedding vows. The announcement named 4 of their 5 sons, but not Donald. Records indicate that he was later held at Bridgewater State Hospital, a facility for prisoners with serious mental illness, from approximately 2011 to 2016. This extended commitment reflects the severity of his mental health issues and his continued classification as a high-risk individual. After his release from Bridgewater, he eventually came to reside in a Veterans Administration building in Bedford, Massachusetts, a placement made possible by his brief service in the Navy. By 2021, DA Anthony Galuni's office committed resources to staffing a dedicated unit to unresolved cases. This effort resulted in the resolution of numerous high-profile cases over the years. Amongst those cases was Betty Zukowski's murder. The 1997 investigative thread immediately caught the attention of officials. The 2 most significant interviews conducted during the renewed investigation were with Donald's then 95-year-old mother, Marilyn, and his ex-wife. Marilyn recounted the story about Donald killing a girl with a rock, while Donald's ex provided an even more detailed account. Additionally, an intriguing element of the case was rediscovered. During the original investigation, one of the witnesses had described the suspect as wearing a ring with a blue gemstone. Given the other information investigators had, this was likely a class ring, often set with a stone in the school's color. When investigators re-interviewed the ex-wife, they presented her with this detail. She confirmed that Donald had owned a high school class ring that matched the description. She also confirmed that at some point during their marriage, Donald had told her he had lost the ring. In 2022, Trooper Thomas Sullivan and Sergeant Thomas Sveck traveled to the Veterans Administration facility in Bedford where Donald had been residing. He was 73 years old at this time and relied on a walker and appeared to have a feeding tube. But he was still cognitively present enough to understand what investigators were asking him and to formulate responses. During the interview, Donald did not immediately cooperate. He kept going back and forth on acknowledging different aspects of the case, denying involvement at certain points while appearing to accept responsibility at others. At one point during the interview, Donald began to cry. Rather than expressing grief or remorse for Betty in that moment, he made an incredibly self-absorbed comment. He told the investigators that he was not crying because of Betty, but that he was crying about his whole life. 40 years of imprisonment, broken family relationships, the death of a son, and the estrangement from his parents. All of that was of higher priority than Betty's murder. He also made another revealing statement. He told investigators that Betty had, quote, hurt him more than he ever hurt her. Then came the moment that determined the outcome of the case. Without any prompting from the officials, Donald stood up from his seat and made 4 hard, downward striking motions. He then admitted that he had hit Betty with a rock before collapsing back into his seat and sobbing. On November 1st, 2022, a Hampton County grand jury returned an indictment charging Donald with first-degree murder, and he was arrested the following day. At the arraignment, Donald appeared frail and disoriented, with a walker beside him and what appeared to be a feeding tube. When asked to enter a plea, he weakly uttered, "not guilty." At one point, when prosecutor Elizabeth Ferris read his criminal history aloud, Donald appeared to mumble in protest as though he wanted to dispute something. He was held without bail, with his next court date scheduled for May 2023. His health continued to decline, raising questions about whether he would survive to stand trial. In the end, he did not face a jury. On May 2nd, 2024, Donald, at the age of 75, shuffled into court and entered a guilty plea. The charge was reduced from first-degree murder to involuntary manslaughter as part of the plea agreement. Donald was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, followed by 2 years of probation, and was required to register once again as a level 3 offender. Betty Lou's cousin, Fraser Pajek, the same person who had been a pallbearer at her June 1966 funeral, delivered a victim impact statement before the court. At the close of his statement, Fraser addressed the officials involved in solving the case, saying, "You all have given peace for our family." By the time of Donald's arrest and guilty plea, both of Betty's parents had passed away, never getting to see the culprit be held responsible. Roderick Farrell, often referred to simply as Rod, was born on March 28, 1980 in Murray, Kentucky, to two teenage parents. His father, known as Rick, left to join the military shortly after Farrell's birth, and the marriage ended in divorce not long after. Farrell reportedly had no memory of his father at all. His mother, Sandra Gibson, was left to raise him largely on her own. Sandra herself came from a strict Pentecostal fundamentalist household. Her parents, Harold and Rosetta, disapproved of things like makeup, movies, and dancing, and Sandra reportedly felt like an outsider within her own family growing up, a dynamic that closely mirrored the alienation her son would later feel. Sandra added that her parents were immensely abusive both mentally and emotionally, making her life unbearable. As a single mother, she struggled to hold down steady employment and moved frequently, cycling through several relationships, including a brief second marriage. She supported herself and her son partly by working as an exotic dancer, and she also occasionally engaged in work as an escort. During periods when money was especially tight, the two would move in with Sandra's parents, either in Kentucky or later in Florida. Notably, even while living under her parents' roof, Sandra told her son he did not have to obey his grandparents' rules. According to later accounts from Farrell, his maternal grandfather Harold had assaulted him on numerous occasions. Additionally, he claimed that Harold organized groups of his friends to do the same. Farrell's aunt, Lizetta Cruz, corroborated parts of this account, testifying that Harold had abused both her and her sister Sandra when they were growing up. Despite these allegations surfacing, Harold was never criminally charged in connection with any of them. Additionally, according to interviews, Sandra would sometimes grab her son by the hair and physically trash his bedroom while screaming that he had ruined her life. Jaden Murphy, a friend who would later play a significant role in Farrell's descent, recalled in an interview that the mother and son were locked in near constant arguments, and that she frequently accused others of, quote, taking her baby away from her. Even before his teenage years, Farrell displayed an unusual interest in death, including a specific fascination with the electric chair. It was Sandra herself who first exposed her son to the game Vampire the Masquerade, a fantasy game centered on vampire mythology and clan politics that was popular in the 1990s. Sandra's own admitted fascination with vampirism appears to have directly shaped her son's descent into the belief system that would eventually consume him. By his teenage years, Farrell had constructed an elaborate identity for himself. He claimed to be a 500-year-old vampire named Vesigo, a persona built on the idea that he had lived through multiple past lives and had only recently awoken in the body of a teenager. Friends recalled him making grandiose theatrical speeches about his supposed immortality and supernatural destiny, at one point declaring, "I am the devil's child, walking with earthly feet." His substance use escalated around this time as well. He began using marijuana and LSD at age 14, and later escalated to other harder substances. Farrell himself admitted to authorities that he used heavily, and acquaintances noted that his behavior grew increasingly erratic and volatile while under their influence. Compounding his difficulties at school, he was expelled from 9th grade for reasons tied to disciplinary problems, and he found acceptance instead in more gothic subcultures and his vampire lore. During one of the family's stints living in Eustis, Florida, Farrell attended Eustis High School and met 15-year-old Heather Wendorf, a classmate who shared similar interests. She believed in reincarnation, developed a deep interest in the occult, wore predominantly black clothing, and often dyed her hair different colors. Her parents, particularly her mother Ruth, initially encouraged Heather's creative individuality and did not object to her alternative style or interests. Over time, though, tension grew. Ruth found an inverted cross Heather had placed on her bedroom wall, discovered dead flowers arranged around her room, and found a Barbie doll that had been mutilated with a noose tied around its neck. Jennifer also once discovered Heather harming herself. Heather and Farrell would secretly meet at a cemetery across the street from the high school under the pretense that Heather was staying late to watch her sister's cheerleading practice. The pair would take long walks through the graveyard, engaging in deep philosophical conversations about Farrell's supposed immortality. He told her that she too was a reincarnated demon and a prophet destined for something greater than an ordinary human life, and at one point asked her the following: "What if you and I were deemed rulers of the world? Do you think you would fit my purposes? I'm not mortal." Farrell eventually moved back to Murray, Kentucky with his mother to begin his sophomore year of high school, but he and Heather remained in close contact via phone calls. These calls became a significant point of friction in Heather's household. Her parents grew angry over the mounting phone charges, which at one point reportedly reached as much as $850 in a single month. As punishment, Richard assigned Heather yard work, but the calls and the underlying relationship continued regardless. Notably, Heather also had a boyfriend during this period named Jeremy Huber, who grew increasingly frustrated by the influence Farrell seemed to hold over her. Huber later recalled that Heather began telling him she believed she was a demon who had to obey Farrell, describing a kind of psychological hold he had established over her from hundreds of miles away. Huber ultimately decided to end the relationship after these conversations, though Heather told him shortly afterward that she planned to run away with Farrell entirely. According to Huber's later account, Heather said, "I have to do whatever he says. I'm already crossed over, and he said if I don't leave now, he's going to hurt my parents." Heather also maintained a close friendship with another girl, Janine LeClaire, with whom she discussed Farrell's stories about being an immortal being. Farrell reportedly told LeClaire she too was an ancient queen in a past life. Back in Kentucky, Farrell reconnected with a childhood friend named Howard Anderson and formed a new relationship with a fellow Callaway County High School student, Stephen Murphy. Murphy already led a small local group of teenagers devoted to the Vampire Masquerade game, and to real-life vampiric practices, including blood-drinking rituals. Murphy later emphasized in interviews that his group considered itself respectful of life. They did not harm animals or people for blood, and all blood drinking was consensual between members. Word of Farrell's own interest in the occult spread among students, some of whom reportedly tried to provoke a conflict between Farrell and Murphy's group. Instead, when the two finally spoke directly, they discovered significant common ground rooted in their shared backgrounds of poverty and family dysfunction. Murphy later said, "He had the same views, same principles in life. Sometimes it's kill or be killed. We learned that at a very early age as children raised in homes that were not so financially sound." In January 1996, Murphy formally brought Farrell in with a ritual, an initiation known within the group as crossing over. The two met at a specific gravestone, drew blood, and each fed from the other's blood until the bleeding stopped, followed by a period of meditation. Murphy described the ritual as, quote, "one of the most precious gifts you can give to someone, a total commitment. There is no turning back once this is done." In the months following his initiation, Murphy began to notice a troubling shift in Farrell's behavior and gradually distanced himself. The breaking point, according to Murphy, came when he witnessed Farrell violently kill a kitten. As the two talked outdoors, a kitten approached Farrell, who began petting it before it scratched him. Farrell threw the kitten against a tree, killing it, and by his own admission and Murphy's account, appeared to enjoy the act, grinning as it happened. Farrell went on to form his own group separate from Murphy's, recruiting his girlfriend Charity Kesey, a 19-year-old named Dana Cooper, and his friend Howard Anderson. Anderson later noted that all of its core members came from similarly dysfunctional and financially struggling households. Anderson himself had grown up with an alcoholic father and would often bring home leftover food from his job at McDonald's to help feed his younger brothers. Members of this new circle wore black gothic clothing, gathered in cemeteries, and continued the group's practice of drawing blood to drink, all as part of what they believed was a path toward gaining special or immortal powers. At its largest, both Farrell and Murphy's overlapping circles numbered between 25 and 30 teenagers, most of whom were similarly troubled or socially marginalized. The group also began gathering at an abandoned cement structure the members nicknamed the Vampire Hotel, tucked away in a forested area known as Land Between the Lakes. This secluded site became the group's regular meeting place for rituals and discussions, and while no crimes were ever definitively proven to have occurred there, investigators and journalists have long considered it the most likely location where the eventual Florida murders were first discussed and planned. By May 1996, Farrell's behavioral problems had escalated to the point that Callaway High School suspended him. Around this same period, Sandra filed a formal beyond parental control report against her own son, in which she stated that Farrell had become verbally abusive toward her, had threatened to kill her, was harming himself, and was involved with what she characterized as a satanic cult. Tensions between Farrell and Murphy also came to a physical head in September of the same year. Farrell threatened Murphy during a confrontation, and Murphy responded by grabbing him and shoving him against a wall. The altercation resulted in an assault charge against Murphy, who ultimately served 6 months in jail for the incident. The drama took an even more disturbing turn on November 12, 1996, when Sandra was charged after sending explicit letters to Murphy's 14-year-old brother, Jamie. The boy's mother pressed charges after her sons showed her the letters, which framed the proposed relationship in vampiric ritualistic language. One letter quoted by Jones said, "I long to be near you, for your embrace, yes, Jamie, to become a vampire, a part of the family, immortal and truly yours forever." Investigators also discovered that she had built a small shrine in her home devoted to the boy, complete with his photographs, candles, and incense. Weeks before Sandra's arrest, Farrell's group's behavior was escalating, and they produced their first major act of violence. On the evening of October 14, 1996, Farrell and one associate broke into the Murray-Callaway County Animal Shelter. The pair killed 2 puppies and released dozens of dogs from their kennels throughout the facility. Sheriff Stan Scott said, "We're dealing with some sick individuals and I want them caught. This goes way beyond a simple breaking and entering. One of these animals was stomped to death and the other had its legs either pulled or cut off. This is a case of absolute vandalism, and these people need to be caught." By November 2nd, investigators had identified enough evidence to move forward with charges. Sheriff Scott told reporters he was prepared to charge 2 juveniles, later confirmed to include Farrell. This announcement also marked the first time investigators publicly floated a cult connection to the crime, with Scott stating, "Due to the way the animals were dealt with, there was some indication that the incident was related to some kind of cult activity. These are the only 2 we can charge at this time, but the investigation is continuing." In that same statement, Scott estimated that the loosely organized group Farrell belonged to may have included as many as 10 individuals who referred to themselves collectively as the Vampire Clan. Separately, in the first week of November, mutilated puppies were discovered behind the County Humane Society in Murray, and Farrell was brought in for questioning. He denied any involvement in that particular incident. By his own later account, Farrell said he had already been planning to leave Murray for roughly 6 months earlier, citing both the mounting police scrutiny over the animal cruelty allegations and a chaotic home life that had been worsened by his ongoing substance abuse. With the animal shelter investigation closing in and his family situation in turmoil following his mother's arrest, Farrell's small group finalized plans to drive from Kentucky to Eustis, Florida. The group departed Kentucky around November 22nd, intending to pick up both Heather Wendorf and her friend Janine and continue on to New Orleans, where Farrell hoped to establish a permanent vampire family. The stated justification within the group was that Heather was being abused by her father and needed to be rescued, a claim her friends and family later disputed. The group arrived in Eustis, Florida on the evening of November 25th. Rather than going straight to the Wendorf home, the group met Heather down the road from her house. Farrell and Anderson got out of the vehicle and remained behind near the Wendorf property, while Kesey and Cooper drove Heather first to the home of her boyfriend Jeremy Huber so she could say goodbye to him before leaving town for good. Huber later revealed that he tried one final time to talk Heather out of leaving, but she insisted she had no choice, telling him, "I have to do whatever he says. I'm already crossed over," and he said if I don't leave now, he's going to hurt my parents. After leaving Huber's house, Kesey and Cooper drove Heather to the home of her friend Janine, so she could say goodbye there as well. By this point, Janine showed no interest in joining the group on their trip. While these farewells were taking place, Farrell and Anderson remained near the property, waiting for their moment to enter the house. Eventually, they entered the Wendorf residence through an unlocked garage door. Once inside, Farrell picked up a crowbar. At the time of entry, 49-year-old Richard was asleep on the living room couch in front of the TV while his wife, 54-year-old Ruth, was in the shower. Farrell approached Richard as he slept and began striking him repeatedly in the head and chest with the crowbar, ultimately killing him. The autopsy later revealed that Richard sustained 22 separate wounds to his head and face, along with an additional wound to the right side of his chest. His body also bore 9 unexplained burn marks, some of which formed the shape of the letter V, a symbol widely believed to be tied to Farrell's cult identity, in which he reportedly accompanied the V with a dot representing each person he considered part of his vampire following. Farrell was later quoted saying, "I just kept beating him and beating him and beating him, taking pleasure in it." As Farrell and Anderson moved through the house searching for valuables, Ruth emerged from the shower and unexpectedly encountered them in the kitchen. She threw a cup of hot coffee onto Farrell and scratched and clawed at his face. Farrell maintained that his original intention had been to let Ruth live, but that her attack on him provoked him to kill her. The autopsy findings specified that she suffered 23 total wounds, 16 of which were to her head. Throughout both killings, Anderson did not participate directly in the violence. After the killings, Farrell took Richard's credit card before leaving. He and Anderson then took the couple's Ford Explorer, abandoning the plan to continue using Anderson's Buick, and drove to meet back up with Kesey, Cooper, and Heather. Heather was not immediately told that her parents were dead. Farrell reportedly informed Kesey and Cooper of the killings first, with Heather only learning the full truth later. The murders were discovered later that same night by the couple's older daughter, 17-year-old Jennifer, who arrived home around 10:30 p.m. She found her father's body on the living room couch and her mother's body on the kitchen floor. She also discovered that her younger sister Heather was missing, along with a goodbye letter Heather had left behind addressed to her parents and sister. Investigators quickly began questioning people close to Heather, including Jennifer, Heather's boyfriend, and her best friend Janine. Through these interviews, detectives learned that Heather had left Florida with Farrell, whom she had stayed in contact with since he moved away. After leaving and regrouping, the group set out driving in the stolen Ford, intending to reach New Orleans, reportedly in part because Farrell was fond of a particular video arcade located there. Along the route, the group used Richard's stolen credit card to make small purchases, including gas and a knife. Just 2 days after the murders, police had released warrants for all 5 individuals, including Heather. While the group was still at large, rumors and false sightings complicated the search effort back in Kentucky. On November 27th, a Callaway High School student falsely told police that he had been approached and threatened that day at school by either Farrell or Anderson. The student claimed the pair had been driving a white Ford Bronco. While officers were at the student's house taking a statement, a nearby traffic accident caused a power outage, which Sheriff Stan Scott initially suspected might have been an intentional act by the fugitives, prompting him to dispatch every available patrol unit to the boys' location. The false reports also triggered an unrelated high-speed chase involving a different white Ford Bronco that same night in Graves County. Separately, Farrell's grandfather told investigators that Farrell had contacted him and claimed to be somewhere in western Kentucky. Sheriff Scott later said his department fielded at least 10 separate reported sightings, placing the group in western Kentucky during the days they were actually still on the road toward Louisiana. By November 28th, the group had run low on money. Kesey placed a call to her mother, Jody Remington, who lived in South Dakota and worked for her local sheriff's department. Remington had already seen coverage of the Wendorf murders on the news and recognized the significance of her daughter's call. After speaking with Kesey, Remington immediately contacted law enforcement. She then agreed to help authorities by arranging to wire money to her daughter at a Howard Johnson hotel located outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Baton Rouge Police Department was alerted and moved into position at the hotel. The group was arrested without incident at the hotel on November 28th, Thanksgiving Day, and exactly 3 days after the murders. Initially, Farrell attempted to deflect blame, claiming at first that he was being framed by a rival vampire group. All members of the group spoke with detectives regarding their individual roles or lack thereof in the crime. Anderson was confirmed as the only other group member who had been physically present inside the house during the killings. Following their arrest, the 5 were held in jail for approximately 1 week while extradition proceedings to Florida were completed. Once returned to Florida, the group was initially booked into the Lake County Jail before being transferred to a juvenile detention facility in Ocala to await further legal proceedings. In the immediate aftermath of the arrests, investigators explored the possibility that Heather had conspired with Farrell in advance to have her parents killed. 2 individuals came forward claiming Heather had wanted her parents dead, but both accounts were ultimately discredited. A 15-year-old girl named Amber Blood called a Crime Stoppers tip line, claiming to be a friend of Heather's with knowledge of her involvement, but she failed a subsequent polygraph test and admitted she did not actually know Heather. Separately, 14-year-old Brandy Gauncey claimed that Heather had called her boyfriend, Jeremy Huber, to say she had arranged for a couple men from out of state to kill her parents, but Huber denied ever receiving such a call. Farrell's own mother, Sandra, also claimed at one point that she had overheard Heather asking her son to kill her parents, but she later recanted this claim after failing a polygraph test herself. A grand jury subsequently declined to indict Heather in connection with the murders, and she was released. Farrell's trial began on February 12, 1998. Then, 17 years old, Farrell interrupted opening statements to plead guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with armed burglary and armed robbery. In his plea, he claimed that all of his co-defendants were innocent of murder except Anderson, whom he characterized only as an accessory. His defense attorneys argued he was insane, presenting evidence that he had been diagnosed with schizotypal personality disorder and Asperger's syndrome, and evaluators noted he reported experiencing visions of angels and demons. Less than 2 weeks after his guilty plea, a jury returned a unanimous recommendation that Farrell be sentenced to death. Judge Jerry Lockett formally imposed the death sentence, telling Farrell, "I think you are a very disturbed man. I think your family failed you. I think society failed you." Lockett went further, suggesting that Farrell's mother bore some responsibility, stating, "I think Rod Farrell's mother should be on trial for some of this." The sentence made Farrell, at 17, the youngest person on Florida's death row at the time. Howard Anderson was convicted on the same charges as Farrell and sentenced to life in prison. Charity Kesey was convicted of 2 counts of third-degree murder, armed robbery, and armed burglary, receiving a 10-year prison sentence, while Dana Cooper was convicted on similar charges and sentenced to 17 years. Heather Wendorf faced review by 2 separate grand juries but was never charged since she had been in a separate vehicle at the time of the killings. Judge Lockett nonetheless urged prosecutors to pursue an indictment, remarking, "There is genuine evil in this world." Sandra also publicly suggested Heather bore some responsibility for the murders, stating, "There's one person walking around who's just as guilty as he is." In November 2000, the Florida Supreme Court reduced Farrell's death sentence to life imprisonment without parole, part of a broader ruling that barred automatic death sentences for juvenile offenders. Kesey was released from prison in March 2006, and Dana Cooper was released in October 2011, both having served their full terms as accessories. In January 2013, an appellate court denied requests from both Farrell and Anderson for new sentencing hearings. In December 2018, Howard Anderson was resentenced by Judge Don Briggs to 40 years in prison, with credit for the 22 years he had already served, making him eligible for release in 2031. Notably, relatives of Ruth Wendorf, who attended the hearing, did not oppose Anderson's earlier release, expressing greater concern about Farrell's own pending resentencing. Farrell's hearing, originally scheduled for July 2019, was pushed back to November 2019 and then again to early 2020. At a February 2020 hearing, Farrell said, "I know nothing I say or do can bring them back. I hope you know just how truly sorry I am." Despite his statement, the presiding judge ultimately upheld his life without parole sentence in April 2020, determining that Farrell was irreparably corrupt and describing his crimes as among the most appalling. Today, Farrell remains incarcerated in the Florida Department of Correction system, serving 2 consecutive life sentences. Barring any future legal developments, he is expected to remain imprisoned for the rest of his life.